The thumbscrew exemplified this democratic cruelty, a small iron device that fit in the palm of a hand but could destroy a person's ability to function in daily life within minutes. Used extensively across Europe from the 15th through 18th centuries. Thumbscrews appeared in Scottish religious persecutions, the Salem witch trials in 1692, and countless interrogations where authorities needed to extract confessions without leaving visible marks that might generate sympathy. The device consisted of two flat iron bars connected by a screw mechanism. The victim's thumb or finger was placed between the bars, and the interrogator slowly tightened the screw. The progression of damage was predictable and methodical first. The pressure crushed soft tissue and compressed nerves, creating pain so intense that most victims lost consciousness within 5 minutes. If the interrogator paused and allowed the victim to revive, tightening could resume. At a certain point, small bones in the finger, the phalanges began to fracture. The sound was reportedly audible to everyone in the torture chamber, a sharp crack that signaled permanent damage. Further tightening would shatter these bones completely, turning the finger into a pulverized mass of tissue, bone fragments, and damaged nerves that would never heal properly. In Scotland, during the religious conflicts of the 17th century, the device was called pilnywinks and used on Presbyterian dissenters who refused to acknowledge the authority of the Episcopal Church. Court records describe interrogations where all 10 fingers were systematically crushed over the course of hours, with breaks between each digit to allow the victim to consider confession. Those who survived emerged with hands that could no longer grip, write, or perform basic tasks, a lifetime sentence of disability that served as permanent visible reminder of what happened to those who resisted authority. Some versions of thumbscrews included refinements that increased suffering, spiked interior surfaces that tore flesh while crushing bone, or mechanisms that heated the metal bars so the crushing was accompanied by burning. The Salem witch trials of 1,692 inches, Massachusetts saw thumbscrews threatened, though not extensively used. The mere presence of the device in the interrogation room was often sufficient to produce confessions from terrified suspects, who had watched others emerge from questioning with mangled hands. This revealed the true power of torture devices. Their effectiveness extended far beyond actual application to include the anticipatory terror they created in populations that knew such tools existed and might be used on them at any moment. But while thumbscrews destroyed extremities, other devices targeted the core of the body with implements designed to penetrate and tear internal organs. The pair of anguish, also called the choke pair, represented torture's invasion of the body's most intimate spaces, inserted into mouth, rectum, or vagina, then expanded through a screw mechanism until it tore tissue and ruptured organs. Used primarily during the Spanish Inquisition and in various European jurisdictions from the 15th through 17th centuries. The device was shaped like a metal pear, approximately 4 inches long. It consisted of 4 metal petals, or segments held together by a central screw. When the screw was turned, the petals gradually opened outward, like a flower blooming. But instead of gentle expansion, this was violent tearing of whatever tissue surrounded the device. The choice of where to insert the pair was typically determined by the alleged crime oral insertion for heretics and blasphemers whose lying mouths had spread false doctrine. Anal insertion for men accused of sodomy. Vaginal insertion for women accused of adultery or inducing miscarriage. A documented case from 1622, France describes a priest accused of heresy who had the pair inserted into his mouth and expanded until his jaw fractured on both sides. dislocating completely and rendering him unable to speak or eat for the remainder of his life. The expansion didn't need to be dramatic to cause catastrophic damage. Even 1 or 2 full rotations of the screw were sufficient to tear delicate mucous membranes, fracture small bones, and create wounds that would never properly heal. The device's pedals were sometimes spiked on their outer surfaces, ensuring that expansion not only stretched tissue, but actively shredded it. Internal bleeding was common and often fatal, though death might take days or weeks as damaged organs failed and infections set in. The pair's true horror lay in its privacy, unlike public executions that served as community spectacles. This torture happened in closed chambers, where the victims' screams were contained, and the nature of their suffering remained partially hidden. Survivors were released bearing no immediately visible injuries, but their bodies were permanently damaged in ways that only became apparent over time. Women subjected to vaginal insertion often developed fistulas, abnormal connections between organs that caused constant pain and incontinence. Men subjected to anal insertion suffered similar damage plus destruction of the sphincter muscles that made basic bodily functions impossible to control. Oral insertion victims faced lifetime difficulties eating, speaking, and breathing. The device was relatively inexpensive to manufacture, easy to conceal, and left its victims alive, but destroyed a perfect tool for authorities who wanted to punish without the political complications of visible executions. Museum collections in Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands preserve examples of these devices, their brass or iron construction still intact centuries later. Mute testimony to the ingenuity humans applied to causing suffering. But not all torture required elaborate devices. Sometimes the simplest tools proved most effective: a bucket, a rat, and fire created one of history's most psychologically devastating torture methods, combining the primal human fear of being eaten alive with the impossibility of escape. The technique appeared across multiple cultures and time periods documented in medieval Europe, used by Spanish Inquisition interrogators, employed by Dutch colonizers in South America, and horrifyingly, I reported from 20th century torture chambers in Chile under Pinochet's dictatorship from 1973 to 1990. The procedure was simple but devastatingly effective. The victim was restrained on a table or bench, usually naked from the waist up. A metal bucket or cage was placed open side down on the victim's stomach or chest, trapping a live rat inside. Then fire was applied to the top or sides of the bucket, either by placing hot coals directly on the metal or by heating the bucket with torches. The rat, trapped and panicking as the temperature inside the bucket rose, instinctively sought escape, but there was only one direction available: down, through the soft tissue of the human body beneath it. Using its claws and teeth, the rat would begin tearing through skin, then muscle, burrowing into the victim's abdomen in a desperate attempt to escape the heat. The process could take anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on how aggressively the bucket was heated and how large and desperate the rat became. Victims described in the rare cases where they survived the sensation of claws scraping against the inside of their abdominal wall, the feeling of the rat's body moving inside their body cavity, the knowledge that a living creature was literally eating its way through their organs. The screaming was reportedly so intense that in some torture chambers, guards would gag victims to prevent their cries from disturbing neighboring cells or alerting outside observers to what was happening. Historical accounts from the Spanish Inquisition note that prisoners subjected to rat torture often suffered complete psychological breaks, becoming incoherent and unresponsive even if they physically survived. The wounds created by the rat were almost always fatal within days. Due to massive infection, the rat's claws and teeth carried bacteria directly into the body cavity, and 16th century medicine had no effective treatment for peritonitis or sepsis. One particularly detailed account comes from the torture of prisoners during the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule in the 1500s, where Dirk Sonoy, a Dutch rebel leader, reportedly used rat torture against captured Catholic soldiers. The description notes that victims typically lost consciousness after 45 to 60 minutes, not from death, but from shock and pain that overwhelmed the nervous system's ability to process stimuli. Some would revive briefly before dying. Others simply never regained consciousness before succumbing to blood loss and organ failure. The method's effectiveness as an interrogation tool was limited. Victims often became incoherent from trauma before they could provide useful information, but its effectiveness as a terror weapon was absolute. Stories of rat torture spread through armies and civilian populations, creating fear that exceeded the actual frequency of its use. The technique's simplicity meant it required no specialized training or equipment, making it accessible to any torturer with access to rodents and fire. This democratic availability may explain why variations of rat torture appeared independently across widely separated geographic regions and time periods. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate victim witnesses to rat torture. Whether interrogators, guards, or other prisoners who heard the screams, often reported lasting trauma from observing or hearing what happened. This created a class of traumatized participants who carried the memory of these sessions throughout their lives, spreading knowledge of the technique's horrors through their own nightmares and half-told stories. But perhaps the most disturbing documented use of rat torture came from modern rather than medieval sources. Testimony from survivors of Chilean detention centers in the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds described rats being used in sexual torture against female prisoners, with the animals inserted into the vagina or rectum before being provoked into violent movement through electrical shocks or other stimulation. These accounts, documented by human rights organizations and survivor testimony, revealed that the fundamental cruelty underlying rat torture using living creatures as instruments of suffering transcended specific historical periods and appeared wherever authoritarian regimes sought methods of torture that maximized psychological trauma while leaving minimal forensic evidence. The final method, flaying, or removing human skin while the victim remained alive, represented torture at its most fundamental, the literal stripping away of the barrier between self and world, the removal of the organ that defined the body's boundaries. Ancient Assyrian tablets from approximately 700 BCE document the practice with disturbing pride, describing how conquered enemies were skinned and their hides displayed on city walls as warnings. Medieval chronicles record isolated instances across Europe. The execution of Pierre Basile in 1199 France for killing King Richard I included flaying, his skin reportedly removed in strips before his body was burned. The procedure began at the extremities, wrists, or ankles, where executioners made careful incisions that separated skin from the underlying fascia and muscle. Using extremely sharp knives, they would peel the skin away in sections, working slowly up the limbs toward the torso. The victim typically remained conscious for 1 to 2 hours, as skilled executioners worked methodically to maximize survival time. Death eventually came from shock, dehydration, or hypothermia, as the body lost its ability to regulate temperature without the skin's insulating barrier. In some cases, particularly in Assyrian practice, the removed skin was tanned and displayed either stuffed with straw as a grotesque scarecrow or nailed to gates as permanent warning of what awaited those who challenged imperial authority. These 20 methods represent not history's complete catalog of torture, but rather documented examples of how systematically humans have applied intelligence and creativity to the task of causing suffering. Subscribe to Medieval Survival Skills for more documented historical reality about how power weaponizes the human body.